Chapter 18. The climax of the afternoon was reached, however, when after several more dances and drinks, the small river and its possibilities was again brought to the attention of all by Helland, who, looking out of one of the windows, suddenly exclaimed, "What's the matter with the ice down there? Look at this well ice. I dare this crowd to go down there and slide." They were off pell-mell, Ratterer and Tina Kogel, running hand in hand, Sparser and Lucille Nicholas, with whom he had just been dancing, Higby and Laura Sipe, whom he was finding interesting enough for a change, and Clyde and Hortense. But once on the ice, which was nothing more than a narrow, winding stream, blown clean in places by the wind, and curving among thickets of leafless trees, the company were more like young satyrs and nymphs of an older day. They ran here and there, slipping and sliding, Higby, Lucille and Maida immediately falling down, but scrambling to their feet with bursts of laughter. And Hortense, aided by Clyde at first, minced here and there. But soon she began to run and slide, squealing in pretended fear. And now, not only Sparser but Higby, and this in spite of Clyde, began to show Hortense attention. They joined her in sliding, ran after her and pretended to try to trip her up, but caught her as she fell. And Sparser, taking her by the hand, dragged her, seemingly in spite of herself and the others, far upstream and about a curve where they could not be seen. Determined not to show further watchfulness or jealousy, Clyde remained behind. But he could not help feeling that Sparser might be taking this occasion to make a date, even to kiss her. She was not incapable of letting him, even though she might pretend to him that she did not want him to. It was agonizing. In spite of himself, he began to tingle with helpless pain, to begin to wish that he could see them. But Helland, having called everyone to join hands and crack the whip, he took the hand of Lucille Nicholas, who was holding on to Helland's, and gave his other free hand to Maida Axelrod, who in turn gave her free hand to Ratterer. And Higby and Laura Sipe were about to make up the tale when Sparser and Hortense came gliding back, he holding her by the hand. And they now tacked on at the foot. Then Helland and the others began running and doubling back and forth until all beyond Maida had fallen and let go. And, as Clyde noted, Hortense and Sparser, in falling, skidded and rolled against each other to the edge of the shore where were snow and leaves and twigs. And Hortense's skirts, becoming awry in some way, moved up to above her knees. But instead of showing any embarrassment, as Clyde thought and wished she might, she sat there for a few moments without shame and even laughing heartily, and Sparser with her and still holding her hand. And Laura Sipe, having fallen in such a way as to trip Higby, who had fallen across her, they also lay there laughing and yet in a most suggestive position, as Clyde thought. He noted, too, that Laura Sipe's skirts had been worked above her knees. And Sparser, now sitting up, was pointing to her pretty legs and laughing loudly, showing most of his teeth. And all the others were emitting peals and squeals of laughter. Hang it all! Thought Clyde. Why the deuce does he always have to be hanging about her? Why didn't he bring a girl of his own if he wanted to have a good time? What right have they got to go where they can't be seen? And she thinks I think she means nothing by all this. She never laughs that heartily with me, you bet. What does she think I am that she can put that stuff over on me, anyhow? He glowered darkly for the moment, but in spite of his thoughts the line or whip was soon reformed and this time with Lucille Nicholas still holding his hand. Sparser and Hortense at the tail end again. But Helland, unconscious of the mood of Clyde and thinking only of the sport, called, "Better let someone else take the endeavor, hadn't ya?" And feeling the fairness of this, Ratterer and Maida Axelrod and Clyde and Lucille Nicholas now moved down with Higby and Laura Sipe and Hortense and Sparser above them. Only, as Clyde noted, Hortense still held Sparser by the hand, yet she moved just above him and took his hand, he being to the right, with Sparser next above to her left, holding her other hand firmly, which infuriated Clyde. Why couldn't he stick to Laura Sipe, the girl brought out here for him? And Hortense was encouraging him. He was very sad, and he felt so angry and bitter that he could scarcely play the game. He wanted to stop and quarrel with Sparser. But so brisk and eager was Helen that they were off before he could even think of doing so. And then, try as he would, to keep his balance in the face of this, he and Lucille and Ratterer and Maida Axelrod were thrown down and spun around on the ice like curling irons. And Hortense, letting go of him at the right moment, seemed to prefer deliberately to hang on to Sparser. Entangled with these others, Clyde and they spun across 40 feet of smooth, green ice and piled against a snowbank. At the finish, as he found, Lucille Nicholas was lying across his knees face down in such a spanking position that he was compelled to laugh. And Maida Axelrod was on her back, next to Ratterer, her legs straight up in the air, on purpose he thought. She was too coarse and bold for him. And there followed, of course, squeals and guffaws of delight, so loud that they could be heard for half a mile. Helen, intensely susceptible to humor at all times, doubled to the knees, slapped his thighs and bawled. And Sparser opened his big mouth and chortled and grimaced until he was scarlet. So infectious was the result that for the time being Clyde forgot his jealousy. He too looked and laughed. But Clyde's mood had not changed really. He still felt that she wasn't playing fair. At the end of all this playing, Lucille Nicholas and Tina Kogel, being tired, dropped out. And Hortense, also. Clyde at once left the group to join her. Ratterer then followed Lucille. Then the others separating, Helen pushed Maida Axelrod before him downstream out of sight around a bend. Higby, seemingly taking his cue from this, pulled Tina Kogel upstream, and Ratterer and Lucille, seeming to see something of interest, struck into a thicket, laughing and talking as they went. Even Sparser and Laura, left to themselves, now wandered off, leaving Clyde and Hortense alone. And then, as these two wandered toward a fallen log which here paralleled the stream, she sat down. But Clyde, smarting from his fancied wounds, stood silent for the time being, while she, sensing as much, took him by the belt of his coat and began to pull at him. "Gidap, horsey," she played. "Gidap. My horsey has to skate me now on the ice." Clyde looked at her glumly, glowering mentally, and not to be diverted so easily from the ills which he felt to be his. "What'd I want to let that fellow Sparser always hang around you for?" he demanded. "I saw you going up the creek there with him a while ago. What did he say to you up there?" "He didn't say anything." "Oh, no, of course not," he replied cynically and bitterly. "And maybe he didn't kiss you, either." "I should say not," she replied definitely and spitefully. "I'd like to know what you think I am, anyhow. I don't let people kiss me the first time they see me, smarty, and I want you to know it. I didn't let you, did I?" "Oh, that's all right, too," answered Clyde, "but you didn't like me as well as you do him, either." "Oh, didn't I? Well, maybe I didn't, but what right have you to say I like him, anyhow? I'd like to know if I can't have a little fun without you watching me all the time. You make me tired, that's what you do." She was quite angry now because of the proprietary air he appeared to be assuming. And now Clyde, repulsed and somewhat shaken by this sudden counter on her part, decided on the instant that perhaps it might be best for him to modify his tone. After all, she had never said that she had really cared for him, even in the face of the implied promise she had made him. "Oh, well," he observed glumly after a moment, and not without a little of sadness in his tone, "I know one thing. If I let on that I cared for anyone as much as you say you do for me at times, I wouldn't want to flirt around with others like you are doing out here." "Oh, wouldn't you?" "No, I wouldn't." "Well, who's flirting anyhow, I'd like to know." "You are." "I'm not either, and I wish you'd just go away and let me alone if you can't do anything but quarrel with me. Just because I danced with him up there in the restaurant, is no reason for you to think I'm flirting." "Oh, you make me tired, that's what you do I?" "Yes, you do." "Well, maybe I better go off and not bother you any more at all then," he returned, a trace of his mother's courage welling up in him. "Well, maybe you had, if that's the way you're going to feel about me all the time, she answered, and kicked viciously with her toes at the ice. But Clyde was beginning to feel that he could not possibly go through with this, that after all he was too eager about her, too much at her feet. He began to weaken and gaze nervously at her. And she, thinking of her coat again, decided to be civil. "You didn't look in his eyes, did you?" he asked weakly, his thoughts going back to her dancing with Sparser. "When? When you were dancing with him?" "No, I didn't, not that I know of, anyhow. But supposing I did? What of it? I didn't mean anything by it. Gee, criminy, can't a person look in anybody's eyes if they want to? In the way you looked in his? Not if you claimed to like anybody else, I say." And the skin of Clyde's forehead lifted and sank, and his eyelids narrowed. Hortense merely clicked impatiently and indignantly with her tongue. "TST. TST. TST. If you ain't the limit. And a while ago back there on the ice," went on Clyde determinedly and yet pathetically. "When you came back from up there, instead of coming up to where I was, you went to the foot of the line with him. I saw you. And you held his hand, too, all the way back. And then when you fell down, you had to sit there with him holding your hand. I'd like to know what you call that if it ain't flirting. What else is it? I'll bet he thinks it is, all right. Well, I wasn't flirting with him just the same, and I don't care what you say. But if you want to have it that way, have it that way. I can't stop you. You're so darn jealous you don't want to let anybody else do anything, that's all the matter with you. How else can you play on the ice if you don't hold hands, I'd like to know? Gee, criminy. What about you and that Lucille Nicholas? I saw her laying across your lap and you laughing. And I didn't think anything of that. What do you want me to do, come out here and sit around like a bump on a log? Follow you around like a tail? Or you follow me? What you think I am anyhow? A nut? She was being ragged by Clyde, as she thought, and she didn't like it. She was thinking of Sparser, who was really more appealing to her at the time than Clyde. He was more materialistic, less romantic, more direct. He turned and, taking off his cap, rubbed his head gloomily while Hortense, looking at him, thought first of him and then of Sparser. Sparser was more manly, not so much of a crybaby. He wouldn't stand around and complain this way, you bet. He'd probably leave her for good, have nothing more to do with her. Yet Clyde, after his fashion, was interesting and useful. Who else would do for her what he had? And at any rate, he was not trying to force her to go off with him now as these others had gone and as she had feared he might try to do, ahead of her plan and wish. This quarrel was obviating that. Now, see here, she said after a time, having decided that it was best to assuage him and that it was not so hard to manage him after all. Are we going to fight all the time, Clyde? What's the use, anyhow? What d'ya want me to come out here for if you just want to fight with me all the time? I wouldn't have come if I'd thought you were going to do that all day. She turned and kicked at the ice with the minute toe of her shoes, and Clyde, always taken by her charm again, put his arms about her, and crushed her to him, at the same time fumbling at her breasts and putting his lips to hers and endeavoring to hold and fondle her. But now, because of her suddenly developed liking for Sparser, and partially because of her present mood towards Clyde, she broke away, a dissatisfaction with herself and him troubling her. Why should she let him force her to do anything she did not feel like doing, just now, anyhow, she now asked herself. She hadn't agreed to be as nice to him today as he might wish. Not yet. At any rate just now she did not want to be handled in this way by him, and she would not, regardless of what he might do. And Clyde, sensing by now what the true state of her mind in regard to him must be, stepped back and yet continued to gaze gloomily and hungrily at her. And she in turn merely stared at him. I thought you said you liked me, he demanded almost savagely now, realizing that his dreams of a happy outing this day were fading into nothing. Well, I do when you're nice, she replied, slyly and evasively, seeking some way to avoid complications in connection with her original promises to him. Yes, you do, he grumbled. I see how you do. Why, here we are out here now and you won't even let me touch you. I'd like to know what you meant by all that you said, anyhow. Well, what did I say? She countered, merely to gain time. As though you didn't know. Oh, well. But that wasn't to be right away, either, was it? I thought we said. She paused dubiously. I know what you said, he went on. But I noticed now that you don't like me and that's all there is to it. What difference would it make if you really cared for me whether you were nice to me now or next week or the week after? Gee whiz, you'd think it was something that depended on what I did for you, not whether you cared for me. In his pain he was quite intense and courageous. That's not so. She snapped, angrily and bitterly, irritated by the truth of what he said. And I wish you wouldn't say that to me, either. I don't care anything about the old coat now, if you want to know it. And you can just have your old money back, too. I don't want it. And you can just let me alone from now on, too, she added. I'll get all the coats I want without any help from you. At this, she turned and walked away. But Clyde, now anxious to mollify her as usual, ran after her. Don't go, Hortense, he pleaded. Wait a minute. I didn't mean that either, honest I didn't. I'm crazy about you. Honest I am. Can't you see that? Oh, gee, don't go now. I'm not giving you the money to get something for it. You can have it for nothing if you want it that way. There ain't anybody else in the world like you to me, and there never has been. You can have the money for all I care, all of it. I don't want it back. But, gee, I did think you liked me a little. Don't you care for me at all, Hortense? He looked cowed and frightened, and she, sensing her mastery over him, relented a little. Of course I do, she announced. But just the same, that don't mean that you can treat me any old way, either. You don't seem to understand that a girl can't do everything you want her to do just when you want her to do it. Just what do you mean by that? Asked Clyde, not quite sensing just what she did mean. I don't get you. Oh, yes, you do, too. She could not believe that he did not know. Oh, I guess I know what you're talking about. I know what you're going to say now, he went on disappointedly. That's that old stuff they all pull. I know. He was reciting almost verbatim the words and intonations even of the other boys at the hotel, Higby, Ratterer, Eddie Doyle, who, having narrated the nature of such situations to him, and how girls occasionally lied out of pressing dilemmas in this way, had made perfectly clear to him what was meant. And Hortense knew now that he did know. Gee, but you're mean, she said in an assumed hurt way. A person can never tell you anything or expect you to believe it. Just the same, it's true, whether you believe it or not. Oh, I know how you are, he replied, sadly yet a little loftily, as though this were an old situation to him. You don't like me, that's all. I see that now, all right. Gee, but you're mean, she persisted, affecting an injured air. It's the God's truth. Believe me or not, I swear it. Honest it is. Clyde stood there. In the face of this small trick there was really nothing much to say as he saw it. He could not force her to do anything. If she wanted to lie and pretend, he would have to pretend to believe her. And yet a great sadness settled down upon him. He was not to win her after all, that was plain. He turned, and she, being convinced that he felt that she was lying now, felt it incumbent upon herself to do something about it, to win him around to her again. Please, Clyde, please, she began now, most artfully, I mean that. Really, I do. Won't you believe me? But I will next week, sure. Honest, I will. Won't you believe that? I meant everything I said when I said it. Honest, I did. I do like you, a lot. Won't you believe that, too, please? And Clyde, thrilled from head to toe by this latest phase of her artistry, agreed that he would. And once more he began to smile and recover his gaiety. And by the time they reached the car, to which they were all called a few minutes after by Helland, because of the time, and he had held her hand and kissed her often, he was quite convinced that the dream he had been dreaming was as certain of fulfillment as anything could be. Oh, the glory of it when it should come true. Chapter 19. For the major portion of the return trip to Kansas City, there was nothing to mar the very agreeable illusion under which Clyde rested. He sat beside Hortense, who leaned her head against his shoulder. And although Sparser, who had waited for the others to step in before taking the wheel, had squeezed her arm and received an answering and promising look, Clyde had not seen that. But the hour being late and the admonitions of Hellunt, Ratterer and Higby being all for speed, and the mood of Sparser, because of the looks bestowed upon him by Hortense, being the gayest and most drunken, it was not long before the outlying lamps of the environs began to show. For the car was rushed along the road at breakneck speed. At one point, however, where one of the eastern trunk lines approached the city, there was a long and unexpected and disturbing wait at a grade crossing where two freight trains met and passed. Farther in, at North Kansas City, it began to snow, great soft slushy flakes, feathering down and coating the road surface with a slippery layer of mud which required more caution than had been thus far displayed. It was then 5:30. Ordinarily, an additional 8 minutes at high speed would have served to bring the car within a block or two of the hotel. But now, with another delay near Hannibal Bridge owing to grade crossing, it was 20 minutes to 6 before the bridge was crossed and Wyandotte Street reached. And already all four of these youths had lost all sense of the delight of the trip and the pleasure the companionship of these girls had given them. For already they were worrying as to the probability of their reaching the hotel in time. The smug and martendish figure of Mr. Squires loomed before them all. "Gee, if we don't do better than this," observed Ratterer to Higby, who was nervously fumbling with his watch, "we're not going to make it. We'll hardly have time, as it is, to change." Clyde, hearing him, exclaimed, "Oh, crickets! I wish we could hurry a little. Gee, I wish now we hadn't come today. It'll be tough if we don't get there on time." And Hortense, noting his sudden tenseness and unrest, added, "Don't you think you make it all right?" "Not this way," he said. But Hellunt, who had been studying the flake tear outside, a world that seemed dotted with falling bits of cotton, called, "De Willard. We certainly gotta do better dan dis. It means the resu for us if we don't get there on time." And Higby, for once stirred out of a gambler-like effrontery and calm, added, "We'll walk the plank all right unless we can put up some good yarn." "Can't anybody think of anything?" As for Clyde, he merely sighed nervously. And then, as though to torture them the more, an unexpected crush of vehicles appeared at nearly every intersection. And Sparser, who was irritated by this particular predicament, was contemplating with impatience the warning hand of a traffic policeman, which, at the intersection of 9th and Wyandotte, had been raised against him. "There goes his MIT again," he exclaimed. "What can I do about that? I might turn over to Washington, but I don't know whether we'll save any time by going over there." A full minute passed before he was signaled to go forward. Then swiftly he swung the car to the right and 3 blocks over into Washington Street. But here the conditions were no better. 2 heavy lines of traffic moved in opposite directions. And at each succeeding corner several precious moments were lost as the cross traffic went by. Then the car would tear on to the next corner, weaving its way in and out as best it could. At 15th and Washington, Clyde exclaimed to Ratterer, "How would it do if we got out at 17th and walked over?" "You won't save any time if I can turn over there," called Sparser. "I can get over there quicker than you can." He crowded the other cars for every inch of available space. At 16th and Washington, seeing what he considered a fairly clear block to the left, he turned the car and tore along that thoroughfare to as far as Wyandotte once more. Just as he neared the corner and was about to turn at high speed, swinging in close to the curb to do so, a little girl of about 9, who was running toward the crossing, jumped directly in front of the moving machine. And because there was no opportunity given him to turn and avoid her, she was struck and dragged a number of feet before the machine could be halted. At the same time, there arose piercing screams from at least half a dozen women, and shouts from as many men who had witnessed the accident. Instantly they all rushed toward the child, who had been thrown under and passed over by the wheels. And Sparser, looking out and seeing them gathering about a fallen figure, was seized with an uninterpretable mental panic which conjured up the police, jail, his father, the owner of the car, severe punishment in many forms. And though by now all the others in the car were up and giving vent to anguished exclamations such as "Oh, God! He hit a little girl, oh, gee, he's killed a kid. Oh, mercy. Oh, Lord. Oh, heavens, what'll we do now?" He turned and exclaimed, "Jesus, the cops. I gotta get out of this with this car." And, without consulting the others, who were still half standing, but almost speechless with fear, he shot a lever into first, second and then high, and giving the engine all the gas it would endure, sped with it to the next corner beyond. But there, as at the other corners in this vicinity, a policeman was stationed, and having already seen some commotion at the corner west of him, had already started to leave his post in order to ascertain what it was. As he did so, cries of "Stop that car! Stop that car!" reached his ears. And a man, running toward the sedan from the scene of the accident, pointed to it, and called, "Stop that car! Stop that car! They've killed a child!" Then gathering what was meant, he turned toward the car, putting his police whistle to his mouth as he did so. But Sparser, having by this time heard the cries and seen the policeman leaving, dashed swiftly past him into 17th Street, along which he sped at almost 40 miles an hour, grazing the hub of a truck in one instance, scraping the fender of an automobile in another, and missing by inches and quarter-inches vehicles or pedestrians, while those behind him in the car were for the most part sitting bolt upright and tense, their eyes wide, their hands clenched, their faces and lips set, or, as in the case of Hortense and Lucille Nicholas and Tina Kogel, giving voice to repeated, "Oh, gods! Oh, what's going to happen now?" But the police and those who had started to pursue were not to be outdone so quickly. Unable to make out the license plate number and seeing from the first motions of the car that it had no intention of stopping, the officer blew a loud and long blast on his police whistle. And the policeman at the next corner, seeing the car speed by and realizing what it meant, blew on his whistle, then stopped, and springing on the running board of a passing touring car ordered it to give chase. And at this, seeing what was amiss or and 3 other cars, driven by adventurous spirits, joined in the chase, all honking loudly as they came. But the Packard had far more speed in it than any of its pursuers, and although for the first few blocks of the pursuit there were cries of "Stop that car! Stop that car!" still, owing to the much greater speed of the car, these soon died away, giving place to the long wild shrieks of distant horns in full cry. Sparser, by now having won a fair lead and realizing that a straight course was the least baffling to pursue, turned swiftly into McGee, a comparatively quiet thoroughfare along which he tore for a few blocks to the wide and winding Gilham Parkway, whose course was southward. But having followed that at terrific speed for a short distance, he again, at 31st, decided to turn, the houses in the distance confusing him and the suburban country to the north seeming to offer the best opportunity for evading his pursuers. And so now he swung the car to the left into that thoroughfare, his thought here being that amid these comparatively quiet streets it was possible to wind in and out and so shake off pursuit, at least long enough to drop his passengers somewhere and return the car to the garage. And this he would have been able to do had it not been for the fact that in turning into one of the more outlying streets of this region, where there were scarcely any houses and no pedestrians visible, he decided to turn off his lights, the better to conceal the whereabouts of the car. Then, still speeding east, north, and east and south by turns, he finally dashed into one street where, after a few hundred feet, the pavement suddenly ended. But because another cross street was visible 100 feet or so further on, and he imagined that by turning into that he might find a paved thoroughfare again, he sped on and then swung sharply to the left, only to crash roughly into a pile of paving stones left by a contractor who was preparing to pave the way. In the absence of lights he had failed to distinguish this. And diagonally opposite to these, lengthwise of a prospective sidewalk, had been laid a pile of lumber for a house. Striking the edge of the paving stones at high speed, he caromed, and all but upsetting the car, made directly for the lumber pile opposite, into which he crashed. Only instead of striking it head-on, the car struck one end, causing it to give way and spread out, but only sufficiently to permit the right wheels to mount high upon it and so throw the car completely over onto its left side in the grass and snow beyond the walk. Then there, amid a crash of glass and the impacts of their own bodies, the occupants were thrown down in a heap, forward and to the left. What happened afterwards is more or less of a mystery and a matter of confusion, not only to Clyde, but to all the others. For Sparser and Laura Sipe, being in front, were dashed against the windshield and the roof and knocked senseless, Sparser, having his shoulder, hip and left knee wrenched in such a way as to make it necessary to let him lie in the car as he was until an ambulance arrived. He could not possibly be lifted out through the door, which was in the roof as the car now lay. And in the second seat, Clyde, being nearest the door to the left and next to him Hortense, Lucille Nicholas, and Ratterer, was pinioned under and yet not crushed by their combined weights. For Hortense in falling had been thrown completely over him on her side against the roof, which was now the left wall. And Lucille, next above her, fell in such a way as to lie across Clyde's shoulders only, while Ratterer, now topmost of the four, had, in falling, been thrown over the seat in front of him. But grasping the steering wheel in front of him as he fell, the same having been wrenched from Sparser's hands, he had broken his fall in part by clinging to it. But even so, his face and hands were cut and bruised and his shoulder, arm and hip slightly wrenched, yet not sufficiently to prevent his being of assistance to the others. For at once, realizing the plight of the others as well as his own, and stirred by their screams, Ratterer was moved to draw himself up and out through the top or side door which he now succeeded in opening, scrambling over the others to reach it. Once out, he climbed upon the chassis beam of the toppled car, and, reaching down, caught hold of the struggling and moaning Lucille, who like the others was trying to climb up but could not. And exerting all his strength and exclaiming, "Be still, now, honey, I gotcha. You're all right, I'll getcha out," he lifted her to a sitting position on the side of the door, then down in the snow, where he placed her and where she sat crying and feeling her arms and her head. And after her he helped Hortense, her left cheek and forehead and both hands badly bruised and bleeding, but not seriously, although she did not know that at the time. She was whimpering and shivering and shaking, a nervous chill having succeeded the dazed and almost unconscious state which had followed the first crash. At that moment, Clyde, lifting his bewildered head above the side door of the car, his left cheek, shoulder and arm bruised, but not otherwise injured, was thinking that he too must get out of this as quickly as possible. A child had been killed, a car stolen and wrecked, his job was most certainly lost. The police were in pursuit and might even find them there at any minute. And below him in the car was Sparser, prone where he fell, but already being looked to by Ratterer. And beside him Laura Sipe, also unconscious. He felt called upon to do something, to assist Ratterer, who was reaching down and trying to lay hold of Laura Sipe without injuring her. But so confused were his thoughts that he would have stood there without helping anyone had it not been for Ratterer, who called most irritably, "Give us a hand here, Clyde, will you? Let's see if we can get her out. She's fainted." And Clyde, turning now instead of trying to climb out, began to seek to lift her from within, standing on the broken glass window of the side beneath his feet and attempting to draw her body back and up off the body of Sparser. But this was not possible. She was too limp, too heavy. He could only draw her back, off the body of Sparser, and then let her rest there, between the second and first seats on the car's side. But, meanwhile, at the back Helland, being nearest the top and only slightly stunned, had managed to reach the door nearest him and throw it back. Thus, by reason of his athletic body, he was able to draw himself up and out, saying as he did so, "Oh, Jesus, what a finish! Oh, Christ, dis is the limit. Oh, Jesus, we better beat it out of dis before the cops get here." At the same time, however, seeing the others below him and hearing their cries, he could not contemplate anything so desperate as desertion. Instead, once out, he turned and making out Maida below him, exclaimed, "Here, for Christ's sake, gimme your hand. We gotta get out of dis and damn quick, I tell ya." Then turning from Maida, who for the moment was feeling her wounded and aching head, he mounted the top chassis beam again and, reaching down, caught hold of Tina Kogel, who, only stunned, was trying to push herself to a sitting position while resting heavily on top of Higby. But he, relieved of the weight of the others, was already kneeling, and feeling his head and face with his hands. "Gimme your hand, Dave," called Helland. "Hurry. For Christ's sake. We ain't got no time to lose around here. Are ye hurt? Christ, we gotta get outta here, I tell ya. I see a guy comin' across the river now and I don't know whether he's a cop or not." He started to lay hold of Higby's left hand, but as he did so Higby repulsed him. He exclaimed. "Don't pull. I'm all right. I'll get out by myself. Help the others." And standing up, his head above the level of the door, he began to look about within the car for something on which to place his foot. The back cushion having fallen out and forward, he got his foot on that and raised himself up to the door level on which he sat and drew out his leg. Then looking about, and seeing Helland attempting to assist Ratterer and Clyde with Sparser, he went to their aid. Outside, some odd and confusing incidents had already occurred. For Hortense, who had been lifted out before Clyde, and had suddenly begun to feel her face, had as suddenly realized that her left cheek and forehead were not only scraped but bleeding. And being seized by the notion that her beauty might have been permanently marred by this accident, she was at once thrown into a state of selfish panic which caused her to become completely oblivious, not only to the misery and injury of the others, but to the danger of discovery by the police, the injury to the child, the wreck of this expensive car, in fact everything but herself and the probability or possibility that her beauty had been destroyed. She began to whimper on the instant and wave her hands up and down. "Oh, goodness, goodness, goodness!" she exclaimed desperately. "Oh, how dreadful! Oh, how terrible! Oh, my face is all cut!" And feeling an urgent compulsion to do something about it, she suddenly set off, and without a word to anyone and while Clyde was still inside helping Ratterer, south along 35th Street, toward the city where were lights and more populated streets. Her one thought was to reach her own home as speedily as possible in order that she might do something for herself. Of Clyde, Sparser, Ratterer and the other girls, she really thought nothing. What were they now? It was only intermittently and between thoughts of her marred beauty that she could even bring herself to think of the injured child, the horror of which as well as the pursuit by the police, maybe, the fact that the car did not belong to Sparser or that it was wrecked, and that they were all liable to arrest in consequence, affecting her but slightly. Her one thought in regard to Clyde was that he was the one who had invited her to this ill-fated journey, hence that he was to blame, really. Those beastly boys, to think they should have gotten her into this and then didn't have brains enough to manage better. The other girls, apart from Laura Sipe, were not seriously injured, any of them. They were more frightened than anything else, but now that this had happened they were in a panic, lest they be overtaken by the police, arrested, exposed and punished. And accordingly they stood about, exclaiming, "Oh, gee, hurry, can't you? Oh, dear, we ought all of us to get away from here. Oh, it's all so terrible." Until at last Helland exclaimed, "For Christ's sake, keep quiet, can't ya? We're doing the best we can, can't ya see? You'll have the cops down on us in a minute as it is." And then, as if in answer to his comment, a lone suburbanite who lived some 4 blocks from the scene across the fields and who, hearing the crash and the cries in the night, had ambled across to see what the trouble was, now drew near and stood curiously looking at the stricken group and the car. "Had an accident, eh?" he exclaimed, genially enough. "Anyone badly hurt? Gee, that's too bad. And that's a swell car, too. Can I help any?" Clyde, hearing him talk and looking out and not seeing Hortense anywhere, and not being able to do more for Sparser than stretch him in the bottom of the car, glanced agonizingly about. For the thought of the police and their certain pursuit was strong upon him. He must get out of this. He must not be caught here. Think of what would happen to him if he were caught, how he would be disgraced and punished probably, all his fine world stripped from him before he could say a word really. His mother would hear, Mr. Squires, everybody. Most certainly he would go to jail. Oh, how terrible that thought was, grinding really like a macerating wheel to his flesh. They could do nothing more for Sparser, and they only laid themselves open to being caught by lingering. So asking, "Where'd Miss Briggs go?" he now began to climb out, then started looking about the dark and snowy fields for her. His thought was that he would first assist her to wherever she might desire to go. But just then in the distance was heard the horns and the hum of at least 2 motorcycles speeding swiftly in the direction of this very spot. For already the wife of the suburbanite, on hearing the crash and the cries in the distance, had telephoned the police that an accident had occurred here. And now the suburbanite was explaining, "That's them. I told the wife to telephone for an ambulance." And hearing this, all these others now began to run, for they all realized what that meant. And in addition, looking across the fields one could see the lights of these approaching machines. They reached 31st and Cleveland together. Then one turned south toward this very spot, along Cleveland Avenue. And the other continued east on 31st, reconnoitering for the accident. "Beat it, for God's sake, all of youse," whispered Helland, excitedly. "Scatter." And forthwith, seizing Maida Axelrod by the hand, he started to run east along 35th Street, in which the car then lay, along the outlying eastern suburbs. But after a moment, deciding that that would not do either, that it would be too easy to pursue him along a street, he cut northeast, directly across the open fields and away from the city. And now, Clyde, as suddenly sensing what capture would mean, how all his fine thoughts of pleasure would most certainly end in disgrace and probably prison, began running also. Only in his case, instead of following Helland or any of the others, he turned south along Cleveland Avenue toward the southern limits of the city. But like Helland, realizing that that meant an easy avenue of pursuit for anyone who chose to follow, he too took to the open fields. Only instead of running away from the city as before, he now turned southwest and ran toward those streets which lay to the south of 40th. Only much open space being before him before he should reach them, and a clump of bushes showing in the near distance, and the light of the motorcycle already sweeping the road behind him, he ran to that and for the moment dropped behind it. Only Sparser and Laura Sipe were left within the car, she at that moment beginning to recover consciousness. And the visiting stranger, much astounded, was left standing outside. "Why, the very idea," he suddenly said to himself. "They must have stolen that car. It couldn't have belonged to them at all." And just then the first motorcycle reaching the scene, Clyde from his not too distant hiding place was able to overhear. "Well, you didn't get away with it after all, did you? You thought you were pretty slick, but you didn't make it. You're the one we want, and what's become of the rest of the gang, eh? Where are they, eh?" And hearing the suburbanite declare quite definitely that he had nothing to do with it, that the real occupants of the car had but then run away and might yet be caught if the police wished, Clyde, who was still within earshot of what was being said, began crawling upon his hands and knees at first in the snow south and west, always toward some of those distant streets which, lamplit and faintly glowing, he saw to the southwest of him, and among which presently, if he were not captured, he hoped to hide, to lose himself and so escape, if the fates were only kind, the misery and the punishment and the unending dissatisfaction and disappointment which now, most definitely, It all represented to him. Book 2. Chapter 1. The home of Samuel Griffiths in Lycurgus, New York, a city of some 25,000 inhabitants midway between Utica and Albany. Near the dinner hour and by degrees the family assembling for its customary meal. On this occasion the preparations were of a more elaborate nature than usual, owing to the fact that for the past 4 days Mr. Samuel Griffiths, the husband and father, had been absent attending a conference of shirt and collar manufacturers in Chicago, price cutting by upstart rivals in the West having necessitated compromise and adjustment by those who manufactured in the East. He was but now returned and had telephoned earlier in the afternoon that he had arrived, and was going to his office in the factory where he would remain until dinner time. Being long accustomed to the ways of a practical and convinced man who believed in himself and considered his judgment and his decision sound, almost final, for the most part, anyhow, Mrs. Griffiths thought nothing of this. He would appear and greet her in due order. Knowing that he preferred leg of lamb above many other things, after due word with Mrs. Truesdale, her homely but useful housekeeper, she ordered lamb. And the appropriate vegetables and dessert having been decided upon, she gave herself over to thoughts of her eldest daughter Myra, who, having graduated from Smith College several years before, was still unmarried. And the reason for this, as Mrs. Griffiths well understood, though she was never quite willing to admit it openly, was that Myra was not very good looking. Her nose was too long, her eyes too close set, her chin not sufficiently rounded to give her a girlish and pleasing appearance. For the most part she seemed too thoughtful and studious, as a rule not interested in the ordinary social life of that city. Neither did she possess that savoir-faire, let alone that peculiar appeal for men, that characterized some girls even when they were not pretty. As her mother saw it, she was really too critical and too intellectual, having a mind that was rather above the world in which she found herself. Brought up amid comparative luxury, without having to worry about any of the rough details of making a living, she had been confronted, nevertheless, by the difficulties of making her own way in the matter of social favor and love, two objectives which, without beauty or charm, were about as difficult as the attaining to extreme wealth by a beggar. And the fact that for 12 years now, ever since she had been 14, she had seen the lives of other youths and maidens in this small world in which she moved passing gaily enough, while hers was more or less confined to reading, music, the business of keeping as neatly and attractively arrayed as possible, and of going to visit friends in the hope of possibly encountering somewhere, somehow, the one temperament who would be interested in her, had saddened, if not exactly soured her. And that despite the fact that the material comfort of her parents and herself was exceptional. Just now she had gone through her mother's room to her own, looking as though she were not very much interested in anything. Her mother had been trying to think of something to suggest that would take her out of herself, when the younger daughter, Bella, fresh from a passing visit to the home of the Finchleys, wealthy neighbors where she had stopped on her way from the Snedeker school, burst in upon her. Contrasted with her sister, who was tall and dark and rather sallow, Bella, though shorter, was far more gracefully and vigorously formed. She had thick brown, almost black, hair, a brown and olive complexion tinted with red, and eyes brown and genial, that blazed with an eager, seeking light. In addition to her sound and lithe physique, she possessed vitality and animation. Her arms and legs were graceful and active. Plainly she was given to liking things as she found them, enjoying life as it was, and hence, unlike her sister, she was unusually attractive to men and boys, to men and women, old and young, a fact which her mother and father well knew. No danger of any lack of marriage offers for her when the time came. As her mother saw it, too many youths and men were already buzzing around, and so posing the question of a proper husband for her. Already she had displayed a tendency to become thick and fast friends, not only with the scions of the older and more conservative families who constituted the ultra-respectable element of the city, but also, and this was more to her mother's distaste, with the sons and daughters of some of those later and hence socially less important families of the region, the sons and daughters of manufacturers of bacon, canning jars, vacuum cleaners, wooden and wickerware, and typewriters, who constituted a solid enough financial element in the city, but who made up what might be considered the fast set in the local life. In Mrs. Griffith's opinion, there was too much dancing, cabareting, automobiling to one city and another, without due social supervision. Yet, as a contrast to her sister, Myra, what a relief! It was only from the point of view of proper surveillance, or until she was safely and religiously married, that Mrs. Griffith's troubled or even objected to most of her present contacts and yearnings and gaieties. She desired to protect her. "Now, where have you been?" she demanded, as her daughter burst into the room, throwing down her books and drawing near to the open fire that burned there. "Just think, Mama," began Bella most unconcernedly and almost irrelevantly. "The Finchleys are going to give up their place out at Greenwood Lake this coming summer and go up to 12th Lake near Pine Point. They're going to build a new bungalow up there. And Sandra says that this time it's going to be right down at the water's edge, not away from it, as it is out here. And they're going to have a great big veranda with a hardwood floor. And a boathouse big enough for a 30-foot electric launch that Mr. Finchley is going to buy for Stuart. Won't that be wonderful? And she says that if you will let me, that I can come up there for all summer long, or for as long as I like. And Gil, too, if you will. It's just across the lake from the Emery Lodge, you know, and the Eastgate Hotel. And the Fence place, you know, the Fence of Utica, is just below theirs near Sharon. Isn't that just wonderful? Won't that be great? I wish you and Dad would make up your minds to build up there now sometime, Mama. It looks to me now as though nearly everybody that's worth anything down here is moving up there." She talked so fast and swung about so, looking now at the open fire burning in the grate, then out of the two high windows that commanded the front lawn and a full view of Waikiki Avenue, lit by the electric lights in the winter dusk, that her mother had no opportunity to insert any comment until this was over. However, she managed to observe, "Yes? Well, what about the Anthonas and the Nicholsons and the Taylors? I haven't heard of their leaving Greenwood yet." "Oh, I know, not the Anthonas or the Nicholsons or the Taylors. Who expects them to move? They're too old-fashioned. They're not the kind that would move anywhere, are they? No one thinks they are. Just the same, Greenwood isn't like 12th Lake. You know that yourself. And all the people that are anybody down on the South Shore are going up there for sure. The Cranstons next year, Sandra says. And after that, I bet the Harriots will go, too." "The Cranstons and the Harriots and the Finchleys and Sandra," commented her mother, half amused and half irritated. "The Cranstons and you and Bertine and Sandra, that's all I hear these days. For the Cranstons, and the Finchleys, despite a certain amount of local success in connection with this newer and faster set, were, much more than any of the others, the subject of considerable unfavorable comment. They were the people who, having moved the Cranston Viscwire Company from Albany, and the Finchley Electric Sweeper from Buffalo, and built large factories on the south bank of the Mohawk River, to say nothing of new and grandiose houses in Waikiki Avenue and summer cottages at Greenwood, some 20 miles northwest, were setting a rather showy, and hence disagreeable, pace to all of the wealthy residents of this region. They were given to wearing the smartest clothes, to the latest novelties in cars and entertainments, and constituted a problem to those who with less means considered their position and their equipment about as fixed and interesting and attractive as such things might well be. The Cranstons and the Finchleys were in the main a thorn in the flesh of the remainder of the elite of Lycurgus, too showy and too aggressive. How often have I told you that I don't want you to have so much to do with Bertie nor that Letta Harriet or her brother either. They're too forward. They run around and talk and show off too much. And your father feels the same as I do in regard to them. As for Sandra Finchley, if she expects to go with Bertine and you, too, then you're not going to go with her either much longer. Besides, I'm not sure that your father approves of your going anywhere without someone to accompany you. You're not old enough yet. And as for your going to 12th Lake to the Finchleys, well, Unless we all go together, there'll be no going there, either. And now Mrs. Griffiths, who leaned more to the manner and tactics of the older, if not less affluent families, stared complainingly at her daughter. Nevertheless, Bella was no more abashed that she was irritated by this. On the contrary, she knew her mother and knew that she was fond of her, also that she was intrigued by her physical charm as well as her assured local social success as much as was her father, who considered her perfection itself and could be swayed by her least, as well as her much practiced, smile. "Not old enough, not old enough," commented Bella reproachfully. "Will you listen? I'll be 18 in July. I'd like to know when you and Papa are going to think I'm old enough to go anywhere without you both. Wherever you two go, I have to go, and wherever I want to go, you two have to go, too," Bella censured her mother. Then, after a moment's silence, in which her daughter stood there impatiently, she added, "Of course, what else would you have us do? When you are 21 or 2, if you are not married by then, it will be time enough to think of going off by yourself. But at your age, you shouldn't be thinking of any such thing." Bella cocked her pretty head, for at the moment the side door downstairs was thrown open, and Gilbert Griffiths, the only son of this family and who very much in face and build, if not in manner or lack of force, resembled Clyde, his western cousin, entered and ascended. He was at this time a vigorous, self-centered and vain youth of 23 who, in contrast with his two sisters, seemed much sterner and far more practical. Also, probably much more intelligent and aggressive in a business way, a field in which neither of the two girls took the slightest interest. He was brisk in manner and impatient. He considered that his social position was perfectly secure, and was utterly scornful of anything but commercial success. Yet despite this he was really deeply interested in the movements of the local society, of which he considered himself and his family the most important part. Always conscious of the dignity and social standing of his family in this community, he regulated his action and speech accordingly. Ordinarily he struck the passing observer as rather sharp and arrogant, neither as youthful or as playful as his years might have warranted. Still he was young, attractive and interesting. He had a sharp, if not brilliant, tongue in his head, a gift at times for making crisp and cynical remarks. On account of his family and position he was considered also the most desirable of all the young eligible bachelors in Lycurgus. Nevertheless he was so much interested in himself that he scarcely found room in his cosmos for a keen and really intelligent understanding of anyone else. Hearing him ascend from below and enter his room, which was at the rear of the house next to hers, Bella at once left her mother's room, and coming to the door, called, "Oh, Gil, can I come in?" "Sure." He was whistling briskly and already, in view of some entertainment somewhere, preparing to change to evening clothes. "Where are you going?" "Nowhere, for dinner. To the Winants afterwards." "Oh, Constance to be sure." "No, not Constance, to be sure. Where do you get that stuff?" "As though I didn't know." "Lay off. Is that what you came in here for?" "No, that isn't what I came in here for." "What do you think? The Finchleys are going to build a place up at 12th Lake next summer, right on a lake, next to the fence, and Mr. Finchley's going to buy Stuart a 30-foot launch and build a boathouse with a sun parlor right over the water to hold it. Won't that be swell, huh?" "Don't say swell. And don't say huh. Can't you learn to cut out the slang? You talk like a factory girl. Is that all they teach you over at that school? Listen to who's talking about cutting out slang. How about yourself? You set a fine example around here, I notice. Well, I'm 5 years older than you are. Besides, I'm a man. You don't notice Myra using any of that stuff." "Oh, Myra. But don't let's talk about that. Only think of that new house they're going to build and the fine time they're going to have up there next summer. Don't you wish we could move up there, too?" "We could if we wanted to, if Papa and Mama would agree to it." "Oh, I don't know that it would be so wonderful," replied her brother, who was really very much interested just the same. "There are other places besides 12th Lake. Who said there weren't? But not for the people that we know around here. Where else do the best people from Albany and Utica go but there now, I'd like to know. It's going to become a regular center, Sandra says, with all the finest houses along the West Shore. Just the same, the Cranstons, the Lamberts, and the Harriets are going to move up there pretty soon, too, Bella added most definitely and defiantly. That won't leave so many out at Greenwood Lake, nor the very best people, either, even if the Anthonas and Nicholsons do stay here. Who says the Cranstons are going up there? Asked Gilbert, now very much interested. Why, Sandra. Who told her? Bertine. Gee, they're getting gayer and gayer, commented her brother oddly and a little enviously. Pretty soon Lycurgus'll be too small to hold 'em. He jerked at a bow tie he was attempting to center and grimaced oddly as his tight neck band pinched him slightly. For although Gilbert had recently entered into the collar and shirt industry with his father as general supervisor of manufacturing, and with every prospect of managing and controlling the entire business eventually, still he was jealous of young Grant Cranston, a youth of his own age, very appealing and attractive physically, who was really more daring with and more attractive to the girls of the younger set. Cranston seemed to be satisfied that it was possible to combine a certain amount of social pleasure with working for his father, with which Gilbert did not agree. In fact, young Griffiths would have preferred, had it been possible, so to charge young Cranston with looseness, only thus far the latter had managed to keep himself well within the bounds of sobriety. And the Cranston Visquire Company was plainly forging ahead as one of the leading industries of Lycurgus. Well, he added, after a moment, they're spreading out faster than I would if I had their business. They're not the richest people in the world, either. Just the same he was thinking that, unlike himself and his parents, the Cranstons were really more daring if not socially more avid of life. He envied them. And what's more, added Bella interestedly, the Finchleys are to have a dance floor over the boathouse. And Sandra says that Stuart was hoping that you would come up there and spend a lot of time this summer. Oh, did he? Replied Gilbert, a little enviously and sarcastically. You mean he said he was hoping you would come up and spend a lot of time? I'll be working this summer. He didn't say anything of the kind, smarty. Besides, it wouldn't hurt us any if we did go up there. There's nothing much out at Greenwood anymore that I can see. A lot of old hen parties. Is that so? Mother would like to hear that. And you'll tell her, of course. Oh, no, I won't either. But I don't think we're going to follow the Finchleys or the Cranstons up to 12th Lake just yet, either. You can go up there if you want, if Dad'll let you. Just then the lower door clicked again, and Bella, forgetting her quarrel with her brother, ran down to greet her father. Chapter 2. The head of the Lycurgus branch of the Griffiths, as contrasted with the father of the Kansas City family, was most arresting. Unlike his shorter and more confused brother of the Door of Hope, whom he had not even seen for 30 years, he was a little above the average in height, very well knit, although comparatively slender, shrewd of eye, and incisive both as to manner and speech. Long used to contending for himself, and having come by effort as well as results to know that he was above the average in acumen and commercial ability, he was inclined at times to be a bit intolerant of those who were not. He was not ungenerous or unpleasant in manner, but always striving to maintain a calm and judicial air. And he told himself by way of excuse for his mannerisms that he was merely accepting himself at the value that others placed upon him and all those who, like himself, were successful. Having arrived in Lycurgus about 25 years before with some capital and a determination to invest in a new collar enterprise which had been proposed to him, he had succeeded thereafter beyond his wildest expectations. And naturally he was vain about it. His family at this time, 25 years later, unquestionably occupied one of the best, as well as the most tastefully constructed residences in Lycurgus. They were also esteemed as among the few best families of this region, being, if not the oldest, at least among the most conservative, respectable and successful in Lycurgus. His two younger children, if not the eldest, were much to the front socially in the younger and gayer set, and so far nothing had happened to weaken or darken his prestige. On returning from Chicago on this particular day, after having concluded several agreements there which spelled trade harmony and prosperity for at least 1 year, he was inclined to feel very much at ease and on good terms with the world. Nothing had occurred to mar his trip. In his absence the Griffiths Collar and Shirt Company had gone on as though he had been present. Trade orders at the moment were large. Now as he entered his own door he threw down a heavy bag and fashionably made coat and turned to see what he rather expected, Bella hurrying toward him. Indeed she was his pet, the most pleasing and different and artistic thing, as he saw it, that all his years had brought to him: youth, health, gaiety, intelligence and affection, all in the shape of a pretty daughter. "Oh, Daddy," she called most sweetly and enticingly as she saw him enter. "Is that you?" "Yes. At least it feels a little like me at the present moment. How's my baby girl?" And he opened his arms and received the bounding form of his last-born. "There's a good, strong, healthy girl, I'll say," he announced as he withdrew his affectionate lips from hers. "And how's the bad girl been behaving herself since I left?" "No fibbing this time." "Oh, just fine, Daddy. You can ask anyone. I couldn't be better." "And your mother?" "She's all right, Daddy. She's up in her room. I don't think she heard you come in." "And Myra? Is she back from Albany yet?" "Yes. She's in her room. I heard her playing just now. I just got in myself a little while ago." "Eh, hi. Gadding about again. I know you." He held up a genial forefinger, warningly, while Bella swung onto one of his arms and kept pace with him up the stairs to the floor above. "Oh, no, I wasn't either, now," she cooed shrewdly and sweetly. "Just see how you pick on me, Daddy. I was only over with Sandra for a little while." "And what do you think, Daddy? They're going to give up the place at Greenwood and build a big handsome bungalow up on 12th Lake right away. And Mr. Finchley's going to buy a big electric launch for Stuart and they're going to live up there next summer, maybe all the time, from May until October. And so are the Cranstons, maybe." Mr. Griffiths, long used to his younger daughter's wiles, was interested at the moment not so much by the thought that she wished to convey, that 12th Lake was more desirable, socially, than Greenwood, as he was by the fact that the Finchleys were able to make this sudden and rather heavy expenditure for social reasons only. Instead of answering Bella he went on upstairs and into his wife's room. He kissed Mrs. Griffiths, looked in upon Myra, who came to the door to embrace him, and spoke of the successful nature of the trip. One could see by the way he embraced his wife that there was an agreeable understanding between them, no disharmony, by the way he greeted Myra that if he did not exactly sympathize with her temperament and point of view, at least he included her within the largesse of his affection. As they were talking Mrs. Truesdale announced that dinner was ready, and Gilbert, having completed his toilet, now entered. "I say, Dad," he called, "I have an interesting thing I want to see you about in the morning." "Can I?" "All right, I'll be there. Come in about noon. Come on all, or the dinner will be getting cold," admonished Mrs. Griffiths earnestly, and forthwith Gilbert turned and went down, followed by Griffiths, who still had Bella on his arm. And after him came Mrs. Griffiths and Myra, who now emerged from her room and joined them. Once seated at the table, the family forthwith began discussing topics of current local interest. For Bella, who was the family's chief source of gossip, gathering the most of it from the Snedeker School, through which all the social news appeared to percolate most swiftly, suddenly announced, "What do you think, Mama? Rosetta Nicholson, that niece of Mrs. Diston Nicholson, who was over here last summer from Albany, you know, she came over the night of the alumni garden party on our lawn, you remember, the young girl with the yellow hair and squinty blue eyes, her father owns that big wholesale grocery over there. Well, she's engaged to that Herbert Dickham of Utica, who was visiting Mrs. Lambert last summer. You don't remember him, but I do. He was tall and dark and sorta awkward, and awfully pale, but very handsome. Oh, A regular movie hero. There you go, Mrs. Griffiths, interjected Gilbert shrewdly and cynically to his mother. A delegation from the Mrs. Snedeker's select school sneaks off to the movies to brush up on heroes from time to time. Griffiths Sr. suddenly observed, I had a curious experience in Chicago this time, something I think the rest of you will be interested in. He was thinking of an accidental encounter 2 days before in Chicago between himself and the eldest son, as it proved to be, of his younger brother Asa. Also of a conclusion he had come to in regard to him. Oh, what is it, Daddy? Pleaded Bella at once. Do tell me about it. Spin the big news, Dad, added Gilbert, who, because of the favor of his father, felt very free and close to him always. Well, while I was in Chicago at the Union League Club, I met a young man who is related to us, a cousin of you 3 children, by the way, the eldest son of my brother Asa, who is out in Denver now, I understand. I haven't seen or heard from him in 30 years. He paused and mused dubiously. Not the one who is a preacher somewhere, Daddy? Inquired Bella, looking up. Yes, the preacher. At least I understand he was for a while after he left home. But his son tells me he has given that up now. He's connected with something in Denver, a hotel, I think. But what's his son like? Interrogated Bella, who only knew such well-groomed and ostensibly conservative youths and men as her present social status and supervision permitted, and in consequence was intensely interested. The son of a Western hotel proprietor. A cousin? How old is he? Asked Gilbert instantly, curious as to his character and situation and ability. Well, he's a very interesting young man, I think, continued Griffiths tentatively and somewhat dubiously, since up to this hour he had not truly made up his mind about Clyde. He's quite good-looking and well-mannered, too, about your own age, I should say, Gil, and looks a lot like you, very much so, same eyes and mouth and chin. He looked at his son examiningly. He's a little bit taller, if anything, and looks a little thinner, though I don't believe he really is. At the thought of a cousin who looked like him, possibly as attractive in every way as himself, and bearing his own name, Gilbert chilled and bristled slightly. For here in Lycurgus, up to this time, he was well and favorably known as the only son and heir presumptive to the managerial control of his father's business, and to at least a third of the estate, if not more. And now, if by any chance it should come to light that there was a relative, a cousin of his own years and one who looked and acted like him, even, he bridled at the thought. Forthwith, a psychic reaction which he did not understand and could not very well control, he decided that he did not like him, could not like him. What's he doing now? He asked in a curt and rather sour tone, though he attempted to avoid the latter element in his voice. Well, he hasn't much of a job, I must say, smiled Samuel Griffiths, meditatively. He's only a bellhop in the Union League Club in Chicago, at present, but a very pleasant and gentlemanly sort of a boy, I will say. I was quite taken with him. In fact, because he told me there wasn't much opportunity for advancement where he was, and that he would like to get into something where there was more chance to do something and be somebody, I told him that if he wanted to come on here and try his luck with us, we might do a little something for him, give him a chance to show what he could do, at least. He had not intended to set forth at once the fact that he became interested in his nephew to this extent, but, rather to wait and thrash it out at different times with both his wife and son, but the occasion having seemed to offer itself, he had spoken. And now that he had, he felt rather glad of it, for because Clyde so much resembled Gilbert he did want to do a little something for him. But Gilbert bristled and chilled, the while Bella and Myra, if not Mrs. Griffiths, who favored her only son in everything, even to preferring him to be without a blood relation or other rival of any kind, rather warmed to the idea. A cousin who was a Griffiths and good-looking and about Gilbert's age, and who, as their father reported, was rather pleasant and well-mannered, that pleased Bella and Myra, while Mrs. Griffiths, noting Gilbert's face darken, was not so moved. He would not like him. But out of respect for her husband's authority and general ability in all things, she now remained silent. But not so, Bella. "Oh, you're going to give him a place, are you, Dad?" she commented. "That's interesting. I hope he's better looking than the rest of our cousins." "Bella," chided Mrs. Griffiths, while Myra, recalling a gauche uncle and cousin who had come on from Vermont several years before to visit them a few days, smiled wisely. At the same time Gilbert, deeply irritated, was mentally fighting against the idea. He could not see it at all. "Of course we're not turning away applicants who want to come in and learn the business right along now, as it is," he said sharply. "Oh, I know," replied his father, "but not cousins and nephews exactly. Besides, he looks very intelligent and ambitious to me. It wouldn't do any great harm if we let at least one of our relatives come here and show what he can do. I can't see why we shouldn't employ him as well as another. I don't believe Gil likes the idea of any other fellow in Lycurgus having the same name and looking like him," suggested Bella, slyly, and with a certain touch of malice due to the fact that her brother was always criticizing her. "Oh, what rot!" Gilbert snapped irritably. "Why don't you make a sensible remark once in a while? What do I care whether he has the same name or not, or looks like me, either?" His expression at the moment was particularly sour. "Gilbert," pleaded his mother, reprovingly. "How can you talk so? And to your sister, too? Well, I don't want to do anything in connection with this young man if it's going to cause any hard feelings here," went on Griffiths Sr. "All I know is that his father was never very practical, and I doubt if Clyde has ever had a real chance." His son winced at this friendly and familiar use of his cousin's first name. "My only idea in bringing him on here was to give him a start. I haven't the faintest idea whether he would make good or not. He might, and again he might not. If he didn't," he threw up one hand as much as to say, "if he doesn't, we will have to toss him aside, of course." "Well, I think that's very kind of you, Father," observed Mrs. Griffiths, pleasantly and diplomatically. "I hope he proves satisfactory. And there's another thing," added Griffiths wisely and sententiously. "I don't expect this young man, so long as he is in my employ and just because he's a nephew of mine, to be treated differently to any other employee in the factory. He's coming here to work, not play. And while he is here, trying, I don't expect any of you to pay him any social attention, not the slightest. He's not the sort of boy anyhow, that would want to put himself on us, at least he didn't impress me that way, and he wouldn't be coming down here with any notion that he was to be placed on an equal footing with any of us. That would be silly. Later on, if he proves that he is really worthwhile, able to take care of himself, knows his place and keeps it, and any of you wanted to show him any little attention, well, then it will be time enough to see, but not before then." By then, the maid, Amanda, assistant to Mrs. Truesdale, was taking away the dinner plates and preparing to serve the dessert. But as Mr. Griffiths rarely ate dessert, and usually chose this period, unless company was present, to look after certain stock and banking matters which he kept in a small desk in the library, he now pushed back his chair, rose, excusing himself to his family, and walked into the library adjoining. The others remained. "I would like to see what he's like, wouldn't you?" Myra asked her mother. "Yes. And I do hope he measures up to all of your father's expectations. He will not feel right if he doesn't." "I can't get this," observed Gilbert, "bringing people on now when we can hardly take care of those we have. And besides, imagine what the bunch around here will say if they find out that our cousin was only a bellhop before coming here." "Oh, well, they won't have to know that, will they?" said Myra. "Oh, won't they? Well, what's to prevent him from speaking about it, unless we tell him not to, or someone coming along who has seen him there?" His eyes snapped viciously. "At any rate, I hope he doesn't. It certainly wouldn't do us any good around here." And Bella added, "I hope he's not dull as Uncle Alan's two boys. They're the most uninteresting boys I ever did see." Bella cautioned her mother once more. Chapter 3 The Clyde whom Samuel Griffiths described as having met at the Union League Club in Chicago, was a somewhat modified version of the one who had fled from Kansas City 3 years before. He was now 20, a little taller and more firmly but scarcely any more robustly built, and considerably more experienced, of course. For since leaving his home and work in Kansas City and coming in contact with some rough usage in the world, humble tasks, wretched rooms, no intimates to speak of, plus the compulsion to make his own way as best he might, he had developed a kind of self-reliance and smoothness of address such as one would scarcely have credited him with 3 years before. There was about him now, although he was not nearly so smartly dressed as when he left Kansas City, a kind of conscious gentility of manner which pleased, even though it did not at first arrest attention. Also, and this was considerably different from the Clyde who had crept away from Kansas City in a boxcar, he had much more of an air of caution and reserve. For ever since he had fled from Kansas City, and by one humble device and another forced to make his way, he had been coming to the conclusion that on himself alone depended his future. His family, as he now definitely sensed, could do nothing for him. They were too impractical and too poor, his mother, father, Esta, all of them. At the same time, in spite of all their difficulties, he could not now help but feel drawn to them, his mother in particular, and the old home life that had surrounded him as a boy, his brother and sisters, Esta included, since she, too, as he now saw it, had been brought no lower than he by circumstances over which she probably had no more control. And often, his thoughts and mood had gone back with a definite and disconcerting pang because of the way in which he had treated his mother as well as the way in which his career in Kansas City had been suddenly interrupted, his loss of Hortense Briggs, a severe blow, the troubles that had come to him since, the trouble that must have come to his mother and Esta because of him. On reaching St. Louis 2 days later after his flight, and after having been most painfully bundled out into the snow 100 miles from Kansas City in the gray of a winter morning, and at the same time relieved of his watch and overcoat by 2 brakemen who had found him hiding in the car, he had picked up a Kansas City paper, the Star, only to realize that his worst fear in regard to all that had occurred had come true. For there, under a 2-column head, and with fully a column and a half of reading matter below, was the full story of all that had happened. A little girl, the 11-year-old daughter of a well-to-do Kansas City family, knocked down and almost instantly killed. She had died an hour later, Sparser and Miss Sipe in a hospital and under arrest at the same time, guarded by a policeman sitting in the hospital awaiting their recovery. A splendid car very seriously damaged, Sparser's father, in the absence of the owner of the car for whom he worked, at once incensed and made terribly unhappy by the folly and seeming criminality and recklessness of his son. But what was worse, the unfortunate Sparser had already been charged with larceny and homicide, and wishing, no doubt, to minimize his own share in this grave catastrophe, had not only revealed the names of all who were with him in the car, the youths in particular and their hotel address, but had charged that they along with him were equally guilty, since they had urged him to make speed at the time and against his will, a claim which was true enough, as Clyde knew. And Mr. Squires, on being interviewed at the hotel, had furnished the police and the newspapers with the names of their parents and their home addresses. This last was the sharpest blow of all. For there followed disturbing pictures of how their respective parents or relatives had taken it on being informed of their sins. Mrs. Ratterer, Tom's mother, had cried and declared her boy was a good boy, and had not meant to do any harm, she was sure. And Mrs. Helland, Oscar's devoted but aged mother, had said that there was not a more honest or generous soul and that he must have been drinking. And at his own home, the Star had described his mother as standing, pale, very startled and very distressed, clasping and unclasping her hands and looking as though she were scarcely able to grasp what was meant, unwilling to believe that her son had been one of the party and assuring all that he would most certainly return soon and explain all, and that there must be some mistake. However, he had not returned. Nor had he heard anything more after that. For, owing to his fear of the police, as well as of his mother, her sorrowful, hopeless eyes. He had not written for months, and then a letter to his mother only to say that he was well and that she must not worry. He gave neither name nor address. Later, after that he had wandered on, essaying one small job and another, in St. Louis, Peoria, Chicago, Milwaukee, dishwashing in a restaurant, soda clerking in a small outlying drugstore, attempting to learn to be a shoe clerk, a grocer's clerk, and what not, and being discharged and laid off and quitting because he did not like it. He had sent her $10 once, another time 5, having, as he felt, that much to spare. After nearly a year and a half he had decided that the search must have lessened, his own part in the crime being forgotten, possibly, or by then not deemed sufficiently important to pursue, and when he was once more making a moderate living as the driver of a delivery wagon in Chicago, a job that paid him $15 a week, he resolved that he would write his mother, because now he could say that he had a decent place and had conducted himself respectably for a long time, although not under his own name. And so at that time, living in a hall bedroom on the west side of Chicago, Paulina Street, he had written his mother the following letter: "Dear Mother, are you still in Kansas City? I wish you would write and tell me. I would so like to hear from you again and to write you again, too, if you really want me to. Honestly I do, Ma. I have been so lonely here. Only be careful and don't let anyone know where I am yet. It won't do any good and might do a lot of harm just when I am trying so hard to get a start again. I didn't do anything wrong that time, myself. Really I didn't, although the papers said so, just went along. But I was afraid they would punish me for something that I didn't do. I just couldn't come back then. I wasn't to blame and then I was afraid of what you and Father might think. But they invited me, Ma. I didn't tell him to go any faster or to take that car like he said. He took it himself and invited me and the others to go along. Maybe we were all to blame for running down that little girl, but we didn't mean to. None of us. And I have been so terribly sorry ever since. Think of all the trouble I have caused you. And just at the time when you most needed me. Gee. Mother, I hope you can forgive me. Can you? I keep wondering how you are. And Esta and Julia and Frank and Father. I wish I knew where you are and what you are doing. You know how I feel about you, don't you, Ma? I've got a lot more sense now, anyhow. I see things different than I used to. I want to do something in this world. I want to be successful. I have only a fair place now, not as good as I had in K.C., but fair, and not in the same line. But I want something better, though I don't want to go back in the hotel business either if I can help it. It's not so very good for a young man like me, too high-flying, I guess. You see, I know a lot more than I did back there. They like me all right where I am, but I got to get on in this world. Besides, I am not really making more than my expenses here now, just my room and board and clothes, but I am trying to save a little in order to get into some line where I can work up and learn something. A person has to have a line of some kind these days. I see that now. Won't you write me and tell me how you all are and what you are doing? I'd like to know. Give my love to Frank and Julia and Father and Esta, if they are all still there. I love you just the same and I guess you care for me a little, anyhow, don't you? I won't sign my real name, because it may be dangerous yet. I haven't been using it since I left K.C., but I'll give you my other one, which I'm going to leave off pretty soon and take up my old one. Wish I could do it now, but I'm afraid to yet. You can address me, if you will, as Harry Tennant, General Delivery, Chicago. I'll call for it in a few days. I sign this way so as not to cause you or me any more trouble, see? But as soon as I feel more sure that this other thing has blown over, I'll use my own name again, sure? Lovingly, your son. He drew a line where his real name should be and underneath wrote you know and mailed the letter. Following that, because his mother had been anxious about him all this time and wondering where he was, he soon received a letter, postmarked Denver, which surprised him very much, for he had expected to hear from her as still in Kansas City. Dear son, I was surprised and so glad to get my boy's letter and to know that you were alive and safe. I had hoped and prayed that you would return to the straight and narrow path, the only path that will ever lead you to success and happiness of any kind, and that God would let me hear from you as safe and well and working somewhere and doing well. And now he has rewarded my prayers. I knew he would. Blessed be his holy name. Not that I blame you altogether for all that terrible trouble you got into and bringing so much suffering and disgrace on yourself and us, for well I know how the devil tempts and pursues all of us mortals and particularly just such a child as you. Oh, my son, if you only knew how you must be on your guard to avoid these pitfalls. And you have such a long road ahead of you. Will you be ever watchful and try always to cling to the teachings of our Savior that your mother has always tried to impress upon the minds and hearts of all you dear children? Will you stop and listen to the voice of our Lord that is ever with us, guiding our footsteps safely up the rocky path that leads to a heaven more beautiful than we can ever imagine here? Promise me, my child, that you will hold fast to all your early teachings and always bear in mind that right is might. And my boy, never, never, take a drink of any kind no matter who offers it to you. There is where the devil reigns in all his glory and is ever ready to triumph over the weak one. Remember always what I have told you so often: strong drink is raging and wine is a mocker, and it is my earnest prayer that these words will ring in your ears every time you are tempted, for I am sure now that that was perhaps the real cause of that terrible accident. I suffered terribly over that, Clyde, and just at the time when I had such a dreadful ordeal to face with Esta. I almost lost her. She had such an awful time. The poor child paid dearly for her sin. We had to go in debt so deep and it took so long to work it out, but finally we did, and now things are not as bad as they were, quite. As you see, we are now in Denver. We have a mission of our own here now with housing quarters for all of us. Besides, we have a few rooms to rent which Esta, and you know she is now Mrs. Nixon, of course, takes care of. She has a fine little boy who reminds your father and me of you so much when you were a baby. He does little things that are you all over again so many times that we almost feel that you are with us again, as you were. It is comforting, too, sometimes. Frank and Julie have grown so and are quite a help to me. Frank has a paper route and earns a little money which helps. Esta wants to keep them in school just as long as we can. Your father is not very well, but of course, he is getting older, and he does the best he can. I am awful glad, Clyde, that you are trying so hard to better yourself in every way, and last night your father was saying again that your uncle, Samuel Griffiths, of Lycurgus, is so rich and successful, and I thought that maybe if you wrote him and asked him to give you something there so that you could learn the business, perhaps he would. I don't see why he wouldn't. After all, you are his nephew. You know he has a great collar business there in Lycurgus and he is very rich, so they say. Why don't you write him and see? Somehow I feel that perhaps he would find a place for you and then you would have something sure to work for. Let me know if you do and what he says. I want to hear from you often, Clyde. Please write and let us know all about you and how you are getting along. Won't you? Of course we love you as much as ever, and we'll do our best always to try to guide you right. We want you to succeed more than you know, but we also want you to be a good boy, and live a clean, righteous life, for, my son, what matter it if a man gaineth the whole world and loseth his own soul? Write your mother, Clyde, and bear in mind that her love is always with you, guiding you, pleading with you to do right in the name of the Lord. Affectionately, Mother. And so it was that Clyde had begun to think of his Uncle Samuel and his great business long before he encountered him. He had also experienced an enormous relief in learning that his parents were no longer in the same financial difficulties they were when he left, and safely housed in a hotel, or at least a lodging house, probably connected with this new mission. Then 2 months after he had received his mother's first letter, and while he was deciding almost every day that he must do something, and that forthwith, he chanced one day to deliver to the Union League Club on Jackson Boulevard a package of ties and handkerchiefs which some visitor to Chicago had purchased at the store, for which he worked. Upon entering, who should he come in contact with but Ratterer in the uniform of a club employee. He was in charge of inquiry and packages at the door. Although neither he nor Ratterer quite grasped immediately the fact that they were confronting one another again, after a moment Ratterer had exclaimed, "Clyde!" And then seizing him by an arm, he added enthusiastically and yet cautiously in a very low tone, "Well, of all things. The devil! What do you know? Put her there. Where do you come from anyhow?" And Clyde, equally excited, exclaimed, "Well, by jing, if it ain't Tom. What do you know? You working here?" Ratterer, who, like Clyde, had for the moment quite forgotten the troublesome secret which lay between them, added, "That's right. Surest thing you know. Been here for nearly a year, now." Then with a sudden pull at Clyde's arm, as much as to say, "Silence," he drew Clyde to one side, out of the hearing of the youth to whom he had been talking as Clyde came in, and added, "SSH. I'm working here under my own name, but I'd rather not let 'em know I'm from K. See. I'm supposed to be from Cleveland." And with that he once more pressed Clyde's arm genially and looked him over. And Clyde, equally moved, added, "Sure. That's all right. I'm glad you were able to connect. My name's Tennant, Harry Tennant. Don't forget that." And both were radiantly happy because of old times' sake. But Ratterer, noticing Clyde's delivery uniform, observed, "Driving a delivery, eh? Gee, that's funny. You driving a delivery? Imagine. That kills me. What do you want to do that for?" Then seeing from Clyde's expression that his reference to his present position might not be the most pleasing thing in the world, since Clyde at once observed, "Well, I've been up against it, sorta," he added, "but say, I want to see you. Where are you living?" Clyde told him, "That's all right. I get off here at 6. Why not drop around after you're through work? Or, I'll tell you, suppose we meet at, well, how about Henry's on Randolph Street? Is that all right? At 7, say. I get off at 6 and I can be over there by then if you can." Clyde, who was happy to the point of ecstasy in meeting Ratterer again, nodded a cheerful assent. He boarded his wagon and continued his deliveries, yet for the rest of the afternoon his mind was on this approaching meeting with Ratterer. And at 5:30 he hurried to his barn and then to his boarding house on the west side, where he donned his street clothes, then hastened to Henry's. He had not been standing on the corner a minute before Ratterer appeared, very genial and friendly and dressed, if anything, more neatly than ever. "Gee, it's good to have a look at you, old socks," he began. "Do you know you're the only one of that bunch that I've seen since I left K. C. That's right. My sister wrote me after we left home that no one seemed to know what became of either Higby or Huggy, or you, either. They sent that fellow Sparser up for a year, did you hear that? Tough, eh? But not so much for killing the little girl, but for taking the car and running it without a license and not stopping when signaled. That's what they got him for. But say," he lowered his voice most significantly at this point, "what'd got that if they'd got us? Oh, gee, I was scared. And run?" And once more he began to laugh, but rather hysterically at that. "What a wallop, eh? And us leaving him and that girl in the car. Oh, say. Tough, what? Just what else could a fellow do, though? No need of all of us going up, eh? What was her name?" "Laura Sipe. And you cut out before I saw you, even. And that little Briggs girl of yours did, too. Did you go home with her?" Clyde shook his head negatively. "I should say I didn't," he exclaimed. "Well, where did you go then?" he asked. Clyde told him. And after he had set forth a full picture of his own waferings, Ratterer returned with, "Gee, you didn't know that that little Briggs girl left with a guy from out there for New York right after that, did you? Some fellow who worked in a cigar store, so Louise told me. She saw her afterwards just before she left with a new fur coat and all. Clyde winced sadly. Gee, but you were a sucker to fool around with her. She didn't care for you or nobody. But you was pretty much gone on her, I guess, eh? And he grinned at Clyde amusedly, and chucked him under the arm, in his old teasing way. But in regard to himself, he proceeded to unfold a tale of only modest adventure, which was very different from the one Clyde had narrated, a tale which had less of nerves and worry and more of a sturdy courage and faith in his own luck and possibilities. And finally he had caught on to this, because, as he phrased it, you can always get something in Chi. And here he had been ever since, very quiet, of course, but no one had ever said a word to him. And forthwith, he began to explain that just at present there wasn't anything in the Union League, but that he would talk to Mr. Haley, who was superintendent of the club, and that if Clyde wanted to, and Mr. Haley knew of anything, he would try and find out if there was an opening anywhere, or likely to be, and if so, Clyde could slip into it. But pin that worry stuff, he said to Clyde toward the end of the evening. It don't get you nothing. And then only 2 days after this most encouraging conversation, and while Clyde was still debating whether he would resign his job, resume his true name and canvass the various hotels in search of work, a note came to his room, brought by one of the bellboys of the Union League, which read, "See Mr. Lytle at the Great Northern before noon tomorrow. There's a vacancy over there. It ain't the very best, but it'll get you something better later." And accordingly Clyde, after telephoning his department manager that he was ill and would not be able to work that day, made his way to this hotel in his very best clothes. And on the strength of what references he could give, was allowed to go to work, and much to his relief under his own name. Also, to his gratification, his salary was fixed at $20 a month, meals included. But the tips, as he now earned, aggregated not more than 10 a week, yet that, counting meals, was far more than he was now getting, as he comforted himself, and so much easier work, even if it did take him back into the old line, where he still feared to be seen and arrested. It was not so very long after this, not more than 3 months, before a vacancy occurred in the Union League staff. Ratterer, having some time before established himself as day assistant to the club staff captain, and being on good terms with him, was able to say to the latter that he knew exactly the man for the place, Clyde Griffiths, then employed at the Great Northern. And accordingly, Clyde was sent for, and being carefully coached beforehand by Ratterer as to how to approach his new superior, and what to say, he was given the place. And here, very different from the Great Northern and superior from a social and material point of view, as Clyde saw it, to even the Green Davidson, he was able once more to view at close range a type of life that most affected, unfortunately, his bump of position and distinction. For to this club from day to day came or went such a company of seemingly mentally and socially worldly elect as he had never seen anywhere before, the self-integrated and self-centered from not only all of the states of his native land but from all countries and continents. American politicians from the north, south, east, west, the principal politicians and bosses, or alleged statesmen of their particular regions, surgeons, scientists, arrived physicians, generals, literary and social figures, not only from America but from the world over. Here also, a fact which impressed and even startled his sense of curiosity and awe, even, there was no faintest trace of that sex element which had characterized most of the phases of life to be seen in the Green Davidson, and more recently the Great Northern. In fact, in so far as he could remember, had seemed to run through and motivate nearly, if not quite all of the phases of life that he had thus far contacted. But here was no sex, no trace of it. No women were admitted to this club. These various distinguished individuals came and went, singly as a rule, and with the noiseless vigor and reserve that characterizes the ultra-successful. They often ate alone, conferred in pairs and groups, noiselessly, read their papers or books, or went here and there in swiftly driven automobiles, but for the most part seemed to be unaware of, or at least unaffected by, that element of passion, which, to his immature mind up to this time, had seemed to propel and disarrange so many things in those lesser worlds with which up to now he had been identified. Probably one could not attain to or retain one's place in so remarkable a world as this unless one were indifferent to sex, a disgraceful passion, of course. And hence in the presence or under the eyes of such people one had to act and seem as though such thoughts as from time to time swayed one were far from one's mind. After he had worked here a little while, under the influence of this organization and various personalities who came here, he had taken on a most gentlemanly and reserved air. When he was within the precincts of the club itself, he felt himself different from what he really was, more subdued, less romantic, more practical, certain that if he tried now, imitated the soberer people of the world, and those only, that some day he might succeed, if not greatly, at least much better than he had thus far. And who knows? What if he worked very steadily and made only the right sort of contacts and conducted himself with the greatest care here, one of these very remarkable men whom he saw entering or departing from here might take a fancy to him and offer him a connection with something important somewhere, such as he had never had before, and that might lift him into a world such as he had never known. For to say the truth, Clyde had a soul that was not destined to grow up. He lacked decidedly that mental clarity and inner directing application that in so many permits them to sort out from the facts and avenues of life the particular thing or things that make for their direct advancement.